On the business side, there were performing rights royalty battles starting where performing rights societies came into being where they felt like, hey, if you're going to listen to my recording, I performed it, I should get paid every time somebody hears it. And that kind of comes from that whole battle way back when even John Philip Sousa was thinking this will kill the live performance industry, being able to record, so we won't have any audiences anymore. So they came up with this concept that when you heard a recording, the performers and the writers would get paid on some level for it. If it was broadcast on the radio, then the performers should get paid for it. That carries through even today, and it's getting much more complicated, obviously, with the internet, with live streaming, with all the new technologies. The performing rights societies, ASCAP, BMI, CSAC, those are the modern ones in the U.S., but every country has their own performing rights societies, and collecting from different territories and the translation rates and currencies and all this stuff gets very complicated. So you can see how it would be very difficult if I just went and made a recording and streamed it on the internet and everybody in the world could get it. So it's being performed in Germany, it's being performed in France, it's being performed in the US, and all those different performing rights associations have rights in their territories and get paid differently for performances. For entertaining the troops, very important to use film and audio recordings. The men that were in the field would make recordings and send them home to their families. By the end of the 30s, magnetic tape had progressed to sound as good as disc recorders, and mainly developed by German companies through 1945. It's very interesting because captured recorders were copied, and we studied how they got the technology. And this was in 1945, not that long ago. The tape recording was advanced by Ampex Company and 3M. In fact, the first 24-track tape machine was made by 3M, and it was called the M79, the first 24-track tape machine that was actually solid state and not tube. So recording in the 40s, then consumer tape recorders came into being in 1948 and sold millions. 50s, the hi-fi market, they call it hi-fi, high fidelity. It got better and better, and the sound got better, and people would collect recordings and make their hi-fi sound as great as it could be and spend tons of money on making their audio system really amazing. Another story, if I could, is when I was at the University of Wisconsin, I studied audio systems. I'm an electrical engineer, and I studied audio systems, and I specialized in acoustics. And the professor that was my head professor that I was mentored by was a guy that worked for years and years, and all he did was build his stereo. He had 2 columns of speakers, and only the best students could come over to his house at the end of the semester and hear something on his stereo. So that's how neurotic people got about quality of audio recordings. So on one side of the room, he had a column of speakers with 4 18-inch speakers, and it was like a 5-way system all the way up to the ceiling, and same thing on the other side of the room. And he had a turntable that he had to put upstairs in the other side of the house because the vibration of the speakers would make the record jump. And we'd listen to the 1812 overture with the cannons, it was like blow your hair back. It was so loud. It sounded amazing. But he studied his whole life. He studied audio and actually was a consultant for Shure Brothers that made phono cartridges and microphones. And he would tell everybody that his stereo was so powerful, it was 5.2 horsepower. So he had a horsepower rating on his stereo. But people got really neurotically crazy about the quality of sound, and I think people still do, those super high-end hi-fi buffs that want their theater system and their hi-fi to be just amazing. And it became really sort of fevered pitched in the 1950s. A lot of companies started manufacturing a lot of equipment. And so that really put a spike into the development of audio. So then we had 45s, and then LPs were long play records, which you could get 18 to 22 minutes on a side. And that was basically the physical dimensions of your platter and how fast it spun and how much music you could fit on it. And the LP was introduced by CBS in 1948. Studios, however, still used tape because it was the highest quality that you could get. So you'd create a tape, and then you'd send it to manufacturer, and they'd press out these discs. The whole idea is that it was a platter, like a disc, was still a physical medium, which harkens back to when they'd scratch onto a glass cylinder with soot. So it was a real physical medium, Nowadays, obviously, in your iPhones and your iPads and whatever, it's an MP3, which is electronics. So your storage devices have changed dramatically through the years. In the 50s, Les Paul first commissioned an 8-track tape machine. So this is the first time anybody thought of having more than one track to record at different times and overdub. So for the first time, elements didn't have to be recorded all at the same time, all in the same room. You could come back at a later time and add more sound, different instruments, different parts, and you could start overdubbing. So Ampex immediately started marketing a 3-track tape recorder. Phil Spector used it in the early Motown days. So the early Motown recordings were done on 3-track. Well, the industry started really thriving with the fact that people wanted good stereos, they wanted good music, and the recording studios were getting these pro machines with more than 1 track, more than 2 tracks. I even remember back in the day, the mono recordings were 1 track, and then eventually they went to simulated stereo, which was 2 tracks. It wasn't fully stereo, and then they went full stereo, and some of the early Beatles records were simulated stereo, and where they'd put certain sound elements on one side, certain sound elements on the other. And I remember where on one side it's just vocals, on the other side it's just music. So that's how they simulated getting a stereo feel, like putting you more in the middle of the music. And then full stereo came along, where you could actually have positionings of where you put different sound elements. So in 1957, the stereo LP was introduced, and the one good thing about the fact that technology was making recording better and better was that every time they had an improvement, you had to go out and buy a new machine. So the manufacturers loved this. Mono machines, we could sell mono record players, and then we could sell stereo, and the same concept applies from cassettes, 8 tracks, all the different formats that came along through the years. Every time it came along, they could not only sell new equipment, but then people had to buy the same recordings over again in a new format. So the old catalog kept on having a lot of value. In fact, the Beatles catalog still has a lot of value, and it's been transformed from the old days through all of these different formats. And I know personally, when I was in college, I probably bought a couple artists multiple times. So 1950s, high fidelity was a big deal. LP was a major hit. Classical recording, show tunes, and soundtracks. Transistor radios came around 1955. In 1957, RCA introduced the 2-sided tape, so you could make more of each tape. 4 tracks started in the 60s. Used 2 4-tracks to do reduction mixes. The Stones and the Beatles did this. And what I mean by a reduction mix, basically what you do is, with a 4-track tape machine, you can record 4 separate elements on the 4 tracks. And then when you run out of tracks and you want to add more to it, you would take and combine those 4 elements into either a mono or a stereo mix, and you'd sort of lock the perspectives of how loud each element was. And then you'd record it on another tape machine of 4 tracks. So you'd take maybe 4 tracks, combine them down to 1, and record them onto another tape machine, and then it'd give you 3 more tracks to add to it. Right? So you sort of could multi-track more than 4 channels by doing this bounce back and forth between 2 tape machines over and over and over, and every time add more to it. One very interesting thing is if you listen to some of these early recordings, and I found this fascinating because in today's technology, people don't think the way that they did then. They were limited by the technology that they were working with. But in many recordings, and if you listen to some of the early Beatles recordings, you know, a sound element will come in for a chorus part of a song and then go away, and then come back in the next chorus and then go away. Like a piano part that's a melody, sort of a hook line, will happen in the chorus and then go away, and then happen again and then go away. And in today's world, generally when a sound element enters, it kind of stays in the song through the whole song. But back then, the reason that they did it that way is because if you're doing a reduction mix and you've got 4 channels, maybe drums, bass, rhythm guitar, maybe a second acoustic guitar, and you're combining those into mono and you're adding to it, the obvious thing is that you want to do something as simple as possible that you won't mess up on. Because if you do, you got to start the whole thing all over again. You couldn't stop and punch in again on it and fix something that you screwed up on. So basically they would limit the parts down to just the bare essentials of what they felt was necessary in the part, which is a really interesting concept when it comes to music production.